Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now let's start. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the season waits for no one, not even a prince of the realm, and certainly not for a girl with calloused hands and a suspicious proficiency in dead languages. The year was 1816, that dreadful summer when the rain refused to cease and society, forced indoors by the inclement weather, turned to ever more elaborate entertainments to stave off ennui. Oh, how the tongue loves a diversion. And what greater diversion, dear reader, than the arrival of His Royal Highness Prince Xavier Jennings to London. Now, I shall tell you a secret that would make Lady Ponsonby's considerable bosom heave with indignation. Our prince was not precisely enthusiastic about his social obligations. Indeed, the third son of the Duke of Harrington would have much preferred the quiet company of his books to the cacophony of simpering debutantes. Alas, duty called, and His Highness answered, albeit with a countenance that suggested he'd rather be facing Napoleon's army at Waterloo than another evening of quadrilles and matchmaking mammas. Prince Xavier, or Zav, as his intimates dared call him, was that most dangerous of gentlemen, handsome enough to turn heads, but intellectual enough to find the turning tedious. With his striking amber eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around him and dark hair that refused to be tamed, much like the man himself, he cut a figure that launched 1,000 matrimonial campaigns. "I've never seen such a crush," remarked Lady Featherton to the Countess of Diddlebury as they observed from their strategic position near the refreshment table at Almack's. 300 invitations for tonight's assembly, and I dare say not one declined. "And why would they?" replied the Countess, adjusting her turban, a frightful confection of peacock feathers that made her resemble an exotic bird rather than a matron of 63 years. "The prince is of age, unwed, and possessed of a fortune that would make Croesus himself blush with inadequacy." What neither lady knew, what nobody knew, in fact, except perhaps the omniscient narrator addressing you now, was that their quarry had already escaped. For while the crowd awaited his entrance in the ballroom, Prince Xavier had retreated to the library, seeking asylum among leather-bound companions who, unlike their human counterparts, demanded nothing of him but attention. It was there, among the dusty tomes and welcome silence, that he first encountered her. Zephyra James had not intended to be discovered. Indeed, her very livelihood depended upon invisibility. As one of Almack's army of maids, those ghostly figures who appeared before dawn and vanished before the first carriages arrived, she knew her place, and it was certainly not in the presence of royalty. But on this particular evening, the library had beckoned with its siren song of knowledge, and she had succumbed to temptation. Xavier entered silently, believing the room empty, only to freeze at the sight before him. A young woman, dressed in the plain garb of a servant, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a volume of Cicero's letters open on her lap, her lips moving silently as she translated the Latin text. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp with surprise. Zephyra jumped to her feet, the book tumbling from her grasp to land with an accusatory thud on the Turkish carpet. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the intruder. The prince. Here. And she, caught red-handed where no servant had any business being. I was dusting, Your Highness," she stammered, bobbing an awkward curtsy. A single dark eyebrow arched skeptically. "With no duster? And I suppose the book opened itself across your lap while you worked?" Zephyra flushed, her pale complexion betraying her embarrassment with alarming efficiency. "I was returning it to the shelf," she attempted, though the excuse sounded feeble even to her own ears. "You, a liar, know how to read Latin." The prince mocked the cleaning girl, his tone hovering between amusement and disbelief. "Next you'll claim to be fluent in Greek as well." "Only passably so," she replied before she could stop herself, then immediately bit her lower lip in dismay. Xavier's expression shifted from derision to genuine curiosity. He moved closer, studying her as one might an unexpected mathematical proof, with skepticism giving way to fascination. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice softer now, the mockery replaced by something altogether more dangerous, interest. Now, dear reader, allow me to divulge what our prince could not possibly know. Zephyra James was no ordinary maid. The daughter of a brilliant scholar who had committed the unforgivable social sin of marrying beneath his station. She had been raised on a diet of classics, mathematics, and philosophy before typhus claimed both her parents, leaving her alone in a world that valued her only for her ability to scrub floors rather than translate Tacitus. "Nobody of consequence, Your Highness," she answered, her blue eyes, a shade that brought to mind cornflowers in high summer, lowered respectfully, though there was nothing respectful about the stubborn set of her chin. "I find that exceedingly difficult to believe," Xavier replied, bending to retrieve the fallen book. His fingers brushed the page she had been reading. "You were translating this passage about virtue and honor?" She nodded reluctantly, awaiting her dismissal. Or worse, for surely reading a gentleman's books without permission must rank among the cardinal sins of service. But the prince merely said, "You've mistranslated this phrase," pointing to a line near the bottom of the page. Cicero uses the subjunctive here to indicate possibility, not certainty. Zephyra's head snapped up, indignation momentarily overriding caution. "I most certainly have not. The context clearly indicates." She stopped, horror struck at her own impertinence. Instead of anger, however, Xavier's face transformed with a smile that would have sent the debutantes in the ballroom into collective apoplexy. Well, he murmured. "A cleaning girl who argues Latin with a prince. How refreshingly irregular." But their unexpected scholarly debate was interrupted by the library door opening to admit Lord Haverford, the prince's long-suffering equerry. "Your Highness, the patronesses are quite beside themselves. Your absence has been noted, and Lady Jersey is threatening too." He stopped, finally noticing Zephyra, who had pressed herself against the nearest bookshelf as if hoping to disappear into the leather-bound volumes. "Who is this?" "A member of the cleaning staff who appears to have gotten lost," Xavier replied smoothly. "You may go," he added to Zephyra, his tone suddenly formal again. All traces of the animated scholar vanished behind the royal mask. Zephyra curtsied and fled, but not before Xavier noticed something she had dropped in her haste. A small, worn notebook filled with what appeared to be original translations of classical texts, the margins crowded with observations in a neat, decisive hand. He slipped it into his pocket before Lord Haverford could notice. "Your Highness, the quadrille is about to begin, and you've promised Lady Penelope." Yes, Xavier interrupted, straightening his cravat with a resigned sigh. "Lead me to the slaughter, Haverford. But first, tell me, who oversees the household staff here?" And thus, dear reader, the wheels of our romance began to turn, though neither party yet recognized the conveyance for what it was. The following week found London awash in two sensational topics: the unseasonable deluge that had turned Hyde Park into a veritable marsh, and the curious behavior of Prince Xavier, who had attended 3 literary salons in as many days. This unprecedented display of intellectual sociability had the ton in raptures, particularly those families blessed with daughters reputed to have read something beyond fashion plates and romantic novels. He spent a full quarter-hour discussing Herodotus with my Prudence. Lady Merriweather informed her circle at Lady Sefton's morning call, conveniently omitting that poor Prudence, whose education had been limited to watercolors and the pianoforte, had spent those 15 minutes in a state of mute panic, nodding at inappropriate intervals. What the gossips didn't know, and how our narrator relishes knowing what the gossips don't, was that Xavier's sudden interest in literary gatherings had nothing to do with marriage prospects and everything to do with a certain blue-eyed maid who had vanished from Almack's after their encounter. His discreet inquiries had yielded only that she was a recent hire who had failed to return for her wages, a circumstance the housekeeper attributed to the girl's embarrassment at being discovered somewhere she oughtn't to have been. The prince's only clue to her identity remained the notebook, which revealed a mind so keen and original that he found himself returning to its pages night after night, increasingly intrigued by its owner. Meanwhile, Zephyra had indeed fled Almack's, certain that discovery would lead to dismissal at best and imprisonment for theft at worst. She had retreated to her tiny attic room in a boarding house of dubious repute in Southwark, where she eked out a living translating for a discreet bookseller who cared more for her facility with languages than for her social standing or gender. It was there that catastrophe struck for her landlady. A woman whose avarice was matched only by her questionable hygiene discovered her secret cache of books and promptly confiscated them as collateral against 2 weeks' unpaid rent. But they're worthless to anyone but me, Zephyra protested, watching in despair as the woman stuffed her precious volumes into a large burlap sack. They're just old editions with my notes. Then pay what you owe, the harridan replied unsympathetically, or you'll find your scholarly scribblings sold to the rag-and-bone man by week's end. This dire situation might have ended quite tragically indeed had not fate, that most capricious of matchmakers, intervened in the form of Lady Josephine Carrington, a bluestocking of considerable means and even more considerable determination, who happened to be in the market for a new companion after her last had committed the unpardonable offense of eloping with her nephew. Lady Josephine's carriage broke an axle directly outside Zephyra's boarding house, and while repairs were undertaken, the formidable dowager sought refuge from the rain. What she discovered was a young woman in heated argument with a landlady, displaying such command of language, in multiple tongues, no less, that Lady Josephine was immediately enchanted. "You, girl," she called, interrupting what had devolved into a bilingual tirade. "Do you speak Italian as well as you curse in French?" Zephyra, startled into momentary silence, nodded. "And can you read to an old woman whose eyes are failing without mumbling like a schoolroom miss?" Another nod, more hesitant this time. "Excellent. I'll settle your debt, you'll collect your belongings, and we shall depart within the hour. I pay £30 per annum, with room and board included. You'll have Sundays to yourself and access to my library, which I'm told is among the finest private collections in London." It was an offer beyond Zephyra's wildest dreams, and one that landed her, 3 days later, in the very last place she wished to be, Lady Ponsonby's musical evening, where the guest of honor was none other than His Royal Highness, Prince Xavier Jennings. "I cannot accompany you tonight, my lady," Zephyra protested weakly as Lady Josephine's maid arranged the older woman's silver hair beneath a turban only marginally less outrageous than the Countess of Diddlebury's peacock creation. "Nonsense. You've done nothing but hide in the library since your arrival. While I applaud your scholarly dedication, I did not employ you to converse solely with my books." Lady Josephine peered at her reflection critically. "Besides, you'll find the entertainment educational. The prince is said to be most knowledgeable about classical literature, though why a royal should bother with such pursuits when there are horses to race and women to chase is beyond my comprehension." Zephyra, dressed in a borrowed gown of pale blue muslin, simple by ton standards but far finer than anything she had ever owned, stood frozen in the corner of Lady Ponsonby's overcrowded drawing-room. She had artfully arranged Lady Josephine near the pianoforte, then retreated as far as propriety allowed, hoping to remain unnoticed among the potted palms and lesser gentry. Her strategy proved successful through 2 excruciating soprano performances and a violin concerto played with more enthusiasm than skill. But as the guests circulated during the interval, disaster struck. "Lady Josephine," came a masculine voice that sent shivers of recognition down Zephyra's spine. "What a pleasure to see you this evening. I've been reading that treatise on Aristotle you recommended." "Your Highness," the dowager replied with a nod that barely qualified as a bow, "one of the privileges of advanced age and impeccable lineage. Allow me to present my new companion, Miss Zephyra James. She's quite the scholar herself, though she'd rather die than admit it, judging by her current attempt to become one with Lady Ponsonby's drapery." And so it happened that Zephyra found herself face to face with the prince once more, his amber eyes widening in recognition before a smile of genuine delight transformed his features. "Miss James," he said, bowing with a formality that caused several nearby matrons to gasp in astonishment. "I believe we've met before, though under rather different circumstances." Zephyra curtsied deeply, her cheeks flaming. "Your Highness honors me by remembering," she murmured, wishing fervently for the floor to open and swallow her whole. "Indeed," Xavier replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I not only remember, but have been seeking you most diligently. You left something behind in your haste to depart." Her heart sank. Her notebook, her most precious possession after her parents' books. She had been so distraught over its loss that she'd been unable to sleep for days after the incident. I would be most grateful for its return, Your Highness, she whispered, mortified at having to beg a prince for her own property. And I would be most grateful for the opportunity to discuss its contents, he countered, his eyes twinkling with mischief that seemed at odds with his regal bearing. Perhaps during a turn about the room? Lady Josephine, might I borrow your companion for a few moments? Lady Josephine, who had observed this exchange with the keen interest of a naturalist discovering a new species of butterfly, waved them away with a knowing smile. By all means, Your Highness. Do try to return her in the same condition you found her, though a little royal polish never hurt anyone. And thus began what the Tun would later describe as the most peculiar courtship since Lord Byron chased his own cousin around the continent. For Prince Xavier, having finally located his Latin-reading cleaning girl, had no intention of letting her disappear again. Over the following weeks, Zephyra found herself reluctantly drawn into the social whirl of the season, always in Lady Josephine's wake, but increasingly singled out by the prince for conversation at every gathering they attended. Their discussions ranged from Plato to modern politics, from poetry to the deplorable state of women's education, the latter a topic on which Zephyra held opinions so forthright that Lady Josephine regularly claimed to fear for the girl's prospects. No man wants a wife who can argue him into submission in 3 languages, the dowager observed one morning as they returned from a promenade in the park where Xavier had, once again, contrived to walk beside them for nearly half an hour. Then it's fortunate indeed that I have no intention of marrying, Zephyra replied, carefully removing her borrowed bonnet, a confection of straw and silk flowers that she secretly thought made her look like an overdressed maypole. Lady Josephine merely smiled the smile of a woman who has seen 50 seasons come and go, and with them, thousands of adamant declarations crumble in the face of that most persistent of emotions, love. For her part, Zephyra was determined to maintain her guard around the prince. He might find her amusing, even intellectually stimulating, but she harbored no illusions about her place in society, or his. She was the daughter of a disgraced scholar, a girl who had scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. He was 3 heartbeats away from a dukedom and moved in circles so elevated they might as well inhabit different planets. No, whatever his interest in her mind, it could never lead anywhere but heartbreak. Xavier, however, proved surprisingly difficult to discourage. He sent books to Lady Josephine's residence, always addressed to the dowager, of course, but with notes inside that made it clear they were intended for her companion's eyes. He appeared at every event Lady Josephine attended, even those so tedious that most gentlemen would rather have submitted to dental surgery without laudanum than endure them. And then came Lady Harrington's midsummer masquerade, an event so anticipated that even King George reportedly expressed interest in the guest list, though his continued madness made such curiosity dubious at best. "I cannot wear this," Zephyra gasped as Lady Josephine's maid presented her with a gown of silver tissue over blue silk, its neckline considerably lower than anything she had yet been persuaded to don. "You not only can but will," Lady Josephine replied implacably. "I've watched you hide behind high collars and drab colors for months. Tonight, you shall shine, my girl. I've invested too much in your social education to have you skulk in corners like a missionary at a bacchanal." The ball was everything the Tun had hoped, a spectacle of wealth and privilege that would be dissected in drawing rooms for weeks to come. The Harrington estate had been transformed into a fantastical woodland, with real trees imported from the family's country seat, and a small army of footmen dressed as forest creatures serving champagne from silver trays. Zephyra, masked as Diana the Huntress, a costume Lady Josephine had selected with suspicious alacrity, felt exposed and vulnerable without her usual armor of modest attire. The silver diadem in her dark hair kept catching the light from thousands of candles, drawing attention she'd spent a lifetime learning to avoid. She had just decided to seek refuge on a secluded terrace when a tall figure blocked her path, a man dressed as Apollo, his golden mask covering the upper half of his face, but doing nothing to disguise the identity of the prince. "The goddess of the hunt," Xavier said, bowing low over her gloved hand. "How appropriate for one who has led me such a merry chase these past months." "I wasn't aware I was being pursued, Your Highness," Zephyra replied, withdrawing her hand with more haste than grace. Indeed, I rather thought I was being tolerated as Lady Josephine's eccentric project. Is that truly what you believe? He asked, his voice suddenly serious beneath the playful facade of the masquerade. That my interest in you is mere tolerance? Before she could answer, the orchestra struck up a waltz, that most scandalous of dances, still controversial enough that many patronesses refused to permit it in their ballrooms. Dance with me, Xavier said, extending his hand once more. I cannot, she protested. Lady Josephine has not given permission for me to waltz, and even if she had, it would hardly be appropriate for your highness to dance with the woman who has occupied my thoughts since the moment I found her reading Cicero on the floor of Almac's library, he interrupted, stepping closer. I disagree entirely. In fact, I can think of nothing more appropriate. And then, dear reader, he did something that would send ripples of scandal through the ton for years to come. He took her hand, led her to the center of the ballroom, and as 300 of society's most illustrious members watched in slack-jawed astonishment, proceeded to waltz with a nobody. Everyone is staring, Zephyra whispered, her face burning behind her mask. Let them, Xavier replied, his hand warm against her waist as he guided her through the turns with practiced ease. Perhaps they'll learn something about what truly matters in this ridiculous world we inhabit. And what might that be, your highness? That titles and bloodlines and fortunes are poor substitutes for a keen mind and a brave heart, both of which you possess in abundance, Miss James. The music swelled around them, and for a few precious minutes, Zephyra allowed herself to forget who they were and simply enjoy the sensation of being in his arms, moving in perfect harmony as if they had danced together 1,000 times before. But reality reasserted itself as the final notes faded and the crowd closed in, whispers already circulating like wildfire through the assembly. I must go, she said, pulling away from him with reluctance that surprised her. Lady Josephine will be wondering where I've disappeared to. Lady Josephine is perfectly aware of your whereabouts, came the dowager's dry voice as she materialized beside them, leaning heavily on her ebony cane. Indeed, I suspect she and his highness may have conspired in this little drama. Xavier's unrepentant grin confirmed this suspicion. However, Lady Josephine continued, while I applaud your theatrical instincts, your highness, I must insist on removing my companion before Lady Harrington expires from shock. The poor woman is already being fanned most vigorously by 2 footmen and a bishop. The next morning brought the inevitable fallout. Zephyra's name, previously unknown to all but Lady Josephine's intimate circle, was on every tongue in Mayfair. Speculation ran rampant about her origins, her relationship with the prince, and her designs on his royal person. They're saying I'm a fortune hunter, she told Lady Josephine miserably as they sat in the morning room, the dowager calmly sipping chocolate while Zephyra paced like a caged tigress. And worse, that I've used some form of witchcraft to entrap his highness. Nonsense, Lady Josephine replied, setting down her cup with a decisive click. If you possess such powers, I'd expect you to aim considerably higher than a 3rd son, charming though he may be. Besides, the ton always needs something to discuss between courses. Next week it will be someone else's scandal. But Lady Josephine underestimated both the ton's appetite for royal intrigue and Prince Xavier's determination. For that very afternoon, while half of fashionable London called upon the dowager to extract gossip under the guise of courtesy, the prince himself arrived, without appointment and with a proposal that left even the unflappable Lady Josephine momentarily speechless. You wish to establish a school for girls? She repeated, setting aside the novel she had been pointedly reading to discourage her unwanted visitors. And you want my companion to serve as its headmistress? Precisely, Xavier confirmed, apparently oblivious to the sensation his presence was causing among Lady Josephine's callers, who had collectively stopped breathing at his entrance. My mother has agreed to serve as patroness, and I've secured premises in Bloomsbury. All that remains is to convince Miss James to accept the position. Zephyra, who had been attempting to make herself invisible in the corner of the room, looked up in shock. Me? But I have no qualifications for such a role. On the contrary, Xavier countered, turning to face her with an intensity that caused several matrons to reach for their smelling salts. You are the most qualified person in England. You've experienced firsthand the limitations placed on female education and overcome them through sheer determination. Who better to guide young minds similarly constrained by accident of birth or fortune? It was, perhaps, the perfect snare for a woman who valued knowledge above all else, a chance to provide others with the opportunities she had been denied. Yet Zephyra hesitated, sensing some deeper design behind the prince's benevolent proposal. "Why would your highness concern himself with such a project?" she asked, ignoring the scandalized gasps her direct questioning provoked. "Surely there are more pressing matters requiring royal attention than the education of girls without prospects." Xavier smiled, a private smile meant only for her, though witnessed by 24 of London's most dedicated gossips. "Perhaps I've developed an appreciation for brilliant women who know their Cicero," he replied. "Or perhaps I simply wish to spend more time in your company without causing further damage to your reputation. Either way, I hope you'll at least visit the premises before deciding. My carriage awaits, should you and Lady Josephine wish to inspect them now." And so it came to pass that Zephyra James, former maid, scholar in hiding, and current subject of ton speculation, found herself touring a handsome Georgian townhouse in Bloomsbury, its rooms already being prepared for conversion into classrooms and dormitories. "The library will be here," Xavier explained, leading her into a spacious chamber with tall windows and empty shelves awaiting books. "I've taken the liberty of ordering some basic texts, but naturally, you would have complete authority over the curriculum." Zephyra ran her fingers along the polished wood of what would become a reading table, her mind racing with possibilities. To shape young minds, to open doors that society had slammed shut, it was a dream she had never dared to entertain. "And where would I live?" she asked, practical considerations intruding on her momentary fantasy. "There are apartments for the headmistress on the top floor," he replied, watching her face carefully. "Or, if you preferred, you might reside elsewhere." "Elsewhere," she echoed, puzzled by his suddenly hesitant tone. Xavier glanced at Lady Josephine, who had been following their tour with remarkable patience for a woman of her years and temperament. "Might I have a moment alone with Miss James?" he requested. The dowager raised an eyebrow but nodded, allowing a footman to escort her to an adjoining parlor. "Don't do anything that would require me to call out my nephews as your seconds, Your Highness," she warned as she departed. "They're dreadful shots, and I'd hate to see you perforated over a misunderstanding." Once they were alone, Xavier's regal composure faltered for the first time since Zephyra had known him. He paced the length of the empty library, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that left it charmingly disheveled. "This isn't proceeding as I had planned," he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "I had intended a more gradual approach, allowing you to become comfortable with the school, with my involvement in your life, before." "Before what, Your Highness?" Zephyra prompted when he fell silent. Xavier turned to face her, all pretense of aristocratic detachment gone. "Before asking you to marry me," he said simply. Zephyra stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." "I love you," he continued, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "I have loved you since you argued Latin grammar with me while dressed as a maid. I love your mind, your courage, your refusal to accept the limitations others would place upon you. And I want nothing more than to spend my life with you, arguing about translations, building this school, perhaps even raising children who will inherit your brilliant mind and stubborn spirit." "But I'm nobody," she protested weakly, though she made no move to withdraw her hands from his. "The ton would never accept such a match." "Your family." "My family has already given their blessing," he interrupted. "My mother, in particular, is quite eager to meet the woman who finally captured my interest after years of determined bachelorhood. As for the ton," he shrugged, a gesture more eloquent than words. "They'll adjust, as they always do when faced with a fait accompli." "You make it sound so simple," Zephyra said, still unable to fully comprehend what was happening. "This man, this prince, wanted to marry her?" "It is simple," Xavier insisted, raising one hand to gently cup her cheek. "I love you. I believe you might love me as well, if given time and encouragement. Everything else is mere detail." "Detail?" she repeated, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. I think the Duke of Harrington might consider his son marrying a former maid somewhat more significant than a detail. The Duke of Harrington, Xavier replied with a grin that transformed his handsome face into something almost boyish, was so impressed by your translation of Ovid, the one I shamelessly presented as a scholarly curiosity without revealing its author, that he declared the unknown translator a mind worthy of Oxford. Had Oxford the sense to admit those without certain anatomical appendages? Zephyra couldn't help but laugh at this, the tension of the moment breaking like sunshine through clouds. You showed my work to a duke? I did, Xavier confirmed, his eyes never leaving hers. Just as I intend to show you to the world. Not as my wife, though you would be that too, but as a scholar and educator in your own right. It was, perhaps, the most romantic proposal ever offered in a half-furnished library in Bloomsbury, not a promise of wealth or status, but of recognition for her mind and purpose for her passion. Yes, Zephyra said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Yes, I will marry you, Xavier. His smile could have illuminated the library better than 1,000 candles as he drew her into his arms and, finally, kissed her, a kiss that Lady Josephine, returning at that precise moment, observed with more satisfaction than shock. Well, the Dowager announced, thumping her cane on the floor to announce her presence. I see my services as chaperone have been rendered somewhat redundant. Shall I assume congratulations are in order? Xavier reluctantly released Zephyra, though he kept one arm firmly around her waist. They are indeed, my lady. Miss James has done me the honor of accepting my proposal. Good. Lady Josephine replied briskly. I was beginning to fear I'd have to lock you both in a closet to achieve this outcome. The tension between you has been giving me hives for weeks. And so, dear reader, our tale concludes not with a scandal, but with a wedding, one attended by royalty and scholars alike, where the bride wore blue silk and carried a bouquet that concealed a small volume of Cicero, and where the prince vowed to love, honor, and never again mock a cleaning girl who knew her Latin. Lady Ponsonby did indeed nearly faint when the engagement was announced, and the Countess of Diddlebury's new turban, this one adorned with silk roses and what appeared to be stuffed hummingbirds, tilted at such an alarming angle upon hearing the news that it nearly poked out the eye of an unfortunate viscount. But society, as Prince Xavier had predicted, adjusted to the match with remarkable speed, helped along by the Duchess of Harrington's enthusiastic approval and the generous donations suddenly flowing toward charitable causes championed by those who welcomed the new princess with open arms. The school opened 6 months after the wedding, with a waiting list that included daughters of both nobility and shopkeepers. Its library, fully stocked with texts in 6 languages, became renowned throughout England, as did its headmistress, who continued to teach even after giving birth to the first of 3 children who would, indeed, inherit their mother's brilliant mind and their father's determined spirit. And if, occasionally, the royal couple was discovered by their staff engaged in heated debates over obscure points of classical grammar, well, the ton found such scholarly devotion quite romantic, in its peculiar way. After all, what greater love story could there be than one built on mutual respect, shared passion for knowledge, and the recognition that true nobility comes not from birth, but from character? Thus, our prince was left, not mocking, but marveling at the woman who had transformed his life with nothing more than a book of Cicero and the courage to read it.